You think you know what a Viking looked like? Blonde, blue-eyed, Scandinavian. DNA says, think again. For over 1,000 years, the Viking story has been told the same way. Museums across Europe display the artifacts. The story they tell is always the same. Swords with silver inlay, gold brooches, iron helmets. The material culture of warriors. Scandinavian warriors who sailed from the north, raided the coasts of Europe, and disappeared back into the fjords. Monks wrote about them in terror. Sagas celebrated them in verse. Every account described them as a single people, Northmen, Norsemen, Danes, and the image calcified blonde, Nordic pure. The 19th century turned the stereotype into national mythology, racial purity, Nordic supremacy, a mythology that modern genetics has demolished completely. The horned helmets were invented in the 19th century. The racial purity was invented alongside them. Then in 2020, the largest ancient DNA study of Vikings ever conducted shattered that image. 442 individuals from across the Viking world. The biggest sample of ancient Viking DNA ever assembled. Samples from 12 countries, graves spanning 3 centuries of the Viking Age. Each sample required painstaking extraction from teeth and petrous bones. The petrous bone, smaller than a walnut, contains more preserved DNA than any other skeletal element. And the first result was the most shocking. Vikings were not a homogeneous population. Some Vikings were genetically Scandinavian, others were British, others were Baltic, some had Southern European ancestry. One individual from a Norwegian burial showed Italian ancestry. Another from Sweden showed Eastern European, buried with a Viking sword in Norway. Born somewhere near the Mediterranean, his reconstructed face showed features no one expected to find in a Norwegian grave. 4 Vikings, 4 completely different genetic backgrounds, all buried with the same cultural identity.
Viking was a job description, not an ethnicity. The DNA proved it.
The word Viking comes from Old Norse and likely meant something like one who goes on an expedition. You could become a Viking. You did not have to be born one. Adoption into the Viking warrior class was cultural, not genetic. Skill and loyalty mattered. The arm ring sealed the bond. Oath-sworn loyalty. It did not require shared blood. Blood brotherhood, a concept that made genetic origin irrelevant to social standing. And the DNA confirms this. Viking Age graves across Scandinavia contain individuals with no Scandinavian ancestry at all. A man buried with full Viking honors in Denmark, whose genome was almost entirely British and Irish. The burial rites were the same, whether the warrior was born in Jutland or in Dublin. He was buried as a Viking. His DNA said he was born in the British Isles. The Margarian study revealed several more surprises. Not all Vikings were blonde. Pigmentation analysis of the 442 genomes showed a wide range. Dark hair was common. Brown eyes appeared regularly. The blonde Viking stereotype was just that. Roughly 40% of the sampled Vikings were predicted to have dark hair, not blonde. Blonde, brown, red, and black. The Viking Age population looked like modern Northern Europe. Mixed. The genes for light pigmentation were present, but not universal. Selection for blonde hair was still ongoing. Light skin and eyes were becoming more common. But the process was still underway during the Viking Age. The Hollywood Viking never existed. The real Vikings looked like a cross-section of Northern Europe. The study also mapped where different Viking groups traveled, and the routes followed genetic lines. Danish Vikings went west to England. Swedish Vikings went east to the Baltic and Russia. Arabic silver coins found in Swedish hoards. The Eastern Vikings traded with the Islamic world. They dragged their ships between rivers to reach the Black Sea and Constantinople. 2,000 kilometers of river navigation, with overland portages between waterways. The portages could take days, but the silver waiting at the end made every step worthwhile. Norwegian Vikings went north and west to Scotland, Iceland, and the North Atlantic. These were not one people. They were several related but genetically distinct populations sharing a cultural framework. Danes, Swedes, and Norwegians were as genetically different from each other as many modern European nations. The Viking Age was not one migration. It was dozens in every direction, all at once. Iceland is where the Viking genetic story becomes most revealing. DNA studies of Icelandic founders revealed something the sagas never mentioned. Roughly half of the founding women of Iceland were not Scandinavian. They were Gaelic. The founding mothers of one of Europe's most isolated nations came from two completely different gene pools. Scottish and Irish women brought to Iceland by Norse men, whether voluntarily or not. The sagas describe bringing thralls from Ireland and Scotland. The DNA confirms the practice was systematic. The first Icelanders faced one of the harshest environments in the settled world. Every person counted. The founding of Iceland was built on forced migration. The mitochondrial DNA is the evidence. The founding mothers of Iceland were mostly Celtic. The sagas forgot to mention that. The same sex-biased pattern found in Iceland appears across the entire Viking world. Orkney, Shetland, the Faroe Islands. Everywhere the Vikings settled, the men were Norse and the women were local. The ratio varies by island, but the pattern is universal. Norse Y chromosomes, Celtic mitochondrial DNA. Even the Pharaohs, the most remote Viking settlement in the North Atlantic, show the same genetic signature, same pattern, different island. The Viking settlement model was consistent everywhere. Viking colonization was male-dominated warrior bands who married or enslaved local women. The genetics of every Viking colony are built on this pattern. Norse fathers, local mothers. But here is the twist. Modern Scandinavians are less Viking than people think. The Margarian study revealed that Scandinavia itself received massive gene flow during the Viking Age. While Vikings sailed outward, other populations flowed inward. British, Irish, Baltic, and Eastern European ancestry entered Scandinavia. Trade brought people, people brought genes. Scandinavia was never isolated. The grave goods prove what the DNA confirms. Scandinavia was connected to the entire medieval world. Each artifact is a genetic proxy. Where goods traveled, people followed. Each century of the Viking Age made Scandinavia more genetically mixed, not less. Modern Scandinavians carry more non-Scandinavian ancestry than their Viking Age predecessors. The Viking Age was a two-way exchange. Scandinavia exported warriors. It imported genes. The irony is that the Viking expansion made Scandinavia less Scandinavian. At Birka, Sweden's most famous Viking Age trading center, excavated burials contain individuals from across Europe. Traders, craftspeople, and slaves from every corner of the known world lived and died there. Silk from Byzantium, silver from Baghdad, glass beads from the Rhineland, all found in Birka graves. One burial, 5 continents of origin for the grave goods. The Viking world was global. The artifacts tell the same story as the DNA. Birka was international. And then there is the most controversial Viking burial ever found. Burial BJ 581 at Birka. A warrior buried with a full complement of weapons. Sword, axe, spear, shields, arrows, and 2 horses. For over a century, everyone assumed the warrior was male. Then DNA confirmed the skeleton was female. The most famous Viking warrior was a woman. The Hidenstierna Johnson study, published in 2017, sent shockwaves through archaeology. Some researchers argued the weapons were ceremonial. Others accepted a female warrior at face value. The study ignited one of the fiercest debates in modern archaeology. Was she a warrior or a woman buried with inherited weapons? The weapons showed wear from use. A woman buried with more weapons than most male warriors. The grave goods left no ambiguity about status. The DNA settled the biological question. the cultural debate continues. But one thing is certain. She was buried exactly like the highest-ranking male warriors. The Viking DNA story stretches far beyond Scandinavia, from Newfoundland in the west to the Volga in the east, from Greenland in the north to Sicily in the south. Viking DNA reached Constantinople. Norse warriors served as the Varangian guard of the Byzantine emperors. A Viking carved his name into a marble railing at the Hagia Sophia. His DNA may still be in modern Istanbul. The Normans who conquered England were Viking descendants. So were the Rus who founded Russia. The Normans, Northmen who settled in France, adopted French language and customs, and then conquered England in 1066. The Bayeux Tapestry records the moment, Viking descendants conquering England in French armor. Within a generation, the Normans built castles across England. Viking genes in Norman stone. Their Viking ancestry diluted over centuries, but never disappeared entirely from the English gene pool. In the East, the Rus Vikings gave their name to Russia, Swedish warriors who followed the rivers south to Constantinople. Their genetic footprint in modern Russia is detectable but small, a ruling elite absorbed by a vast Slavic population. Around Novgorod and Kyiv, the traces are strongest. The original Rus Viking power centers. The city the Rus Vikings built still stands. Their genes dissolved into the Russian population within centuries. This face was reconstructed from a burial near Novgorod. Swedish features in Russian soil. Same pattern as Turkey. A small military elite imposes culture without replacing the population. So what is the real genetic legacy of the Vikings? Northern Scotland and the Orkney Islands carry the highest Viking ancestry outside Scandinavia, over 25%. England carries roughly 6% Scandinavian ancestry from the Danelaw period. Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, East Anglia, the old Danelaw still shows in the modern genome. And the border of the Danelaw, the Viking-ruled territory in eastern England, is still visible in the genetics 1,000 years later. A political border from 900 CE is written in the DNA of modern England, 1,000 years, and the genetic border has barely moved. A political border from 900 CE is written in the DNA of modern England. Ireland shows a smaller but measurable Viking signature, concentrated around Dublin and the eastern coast. The Viking trading ports at Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick left a genetic mark that persists 1,000 years later. Beneath modern Dublin lies a Viking city. Beneath modern Irish DNA lies a Viking genetic layer. But the deepest Viking legacy is not in any single country. It is in the principle the DNA revealed. The Vikings were never a race. They were a network, a culture that absorbed everyone it touched. DNA from 442 individuals across the Viking world tells one story, the largest ancient DNA study of any single archaeological culture ever conducted. Genetic diversity, cultural unity, a people defined not by blood, but by what they did. The Thing Assembly, where warriors from every background met as equals under law. They governed by consensus, not by bloodline. The DNA confirms the sagas got this right. Thingvellir, where descendants of Norse warriors and Celtic mothers built the world's oldest parliament. The DNA rewrote the Viking story from beginning to end. The next time someone claims Viking ancestry, ask them which kind. There were dozens, 442 genomes, 12 countries. One conclusion: the Vikings were never who the stories said they were. They were more diverse, more connected, and more human. The longships carried DNA from everywhere, and they left it everywhere too. The ship was the technology that made the Viking genetic revolution possible. Oak planks and iron rivets. Simple technology that connected half the world. Every route carried genes in both directions. The longship was a vector of human diversity. If the Vikings were a genetic melting pot, what does that say about every other warrior culture in history? Sources in the description. Subscribe if you want to see what DNA reveals next. Tell me in the comments which warrior culture you want investigated next.